Every morning, a struggling single mother with barely enough for herself fed a silent homeless man, believing she was helping someone who had nothing, but never realizing the man she served from her last meal was hiding a life worth billions. She was fighting to survive for her child. He was pretending to have nothing to live for, but each quiet exchange at that bus stop was stitching their broken worlds together. What kind of man lives on the street with eyes that don't beg, but watch and remember? And what happens when a woman who gives from emptiness discovers the man she saved was never poor at all? The alarm rang at 5:30 a.m. Sharp and unforgiving. Emily Carter didn't hit snooze. She never did. Snoozing meant risking being late. And being late meant losing hours. And losing hours meant less money. Less money meant choosing again between groceries and electricity, between lunch and bus fare, between today and tomorrow. She slipped out of bed quietly so she wouldn't wake Noah, her 7-year-old son, curled tightly under a threadbare blanket. His breathing was shallow but steady. Emily paused, watching him longer than necessary, as if memorizing the moment in case the day ahead took something from her. She couldn't get back. In the kitchen, she packed 2 containers. One held a small portion of oatmeal mixed with the last spoon of peanut butter. That one was Noah's. The other was thinner, watered down, barely filling the bottom. She stared at it. Then she reached into the cupboard and added the last slice of bread. Not for herself. She wrapped it carefully outside. The early morning air bit through her jacket as she walked toward the bus stop on Jefferson Avenue. The one with the cracked bench and the flickering streetlight that never quite turned off. He was already there. The homeless man sat in the same spot every day, back against the brick wall, hands folded neatly in his lap. His coat was worn, his shoes scuffed beyond repair, but there was something about him that never fit the picture people had in their heads. He didn't ask for money. He didn't call out. He didn't beg. He just existed. "Good morning," Emily said softly, kneeling to hand him the container. Their fingers brushed for half a second. "Thank you," he replied. Voice calm, steady to steady for someone living on the streets. She noticed, as she always did, his eyes. They weren't hollow. They were observant, patient, almost guarded. "You should eat it while it's warm," she said. Already standing. "I will," he answered. She didn't tell him it was all she had left. She didn't tell him she'd skip lunch again. Emily turned toward the bus just as it pulled up, unaware of the way the man watched her walk away, not like someone watching charity, but like someone watching sacrifice. What she didn't know was that this simple act, repeated every morning, without witnesses, without praise, without reward, was about to collide with the past neither of them was ready to face. And somewhere deep inside the man she thought had nothing, something long buried began to stir. The man's name was Jonathan Hale, though no one on Jefferson Avenue knew it. They only knew him as the quiet one. After Emily boarded the bus, Jonathan lifted the container slowly, as if the weight of it was more than food. Steam curled into the cold air, carrying the faint smell of cinnamon. He paused before eating, a habit he had developed not out of hunger, but out of memory. There was a time when meals arrived without thought, a time when breakfast meetings took place on glass tables overlooking city skylines, when assistants worried about calories and investors worried about margins, when food was plentiful, but meaning was scarce. Jonathan closed his eyes, and the street around him dissolved. Flashback 7 years earlier. "Congratulations, Jonathan. You've officially crossed the $1 billion valuation." The room had erupted in applause. Jonathan stood at the head of the table, suit tailored to perfection, smile practiced, heart hollow. He had built Hale Systems from a college dorm room into a global logistics empire. The press called him a visionary. Employees called him relentless. His wife had called him absent. "You promised you'd be home tonight," Claire had said over the phone that morning. "I'll try," he replied, already knowing he wouldn't. That night, when he finally returned to an empty penthouse, her wedding ring sat on the counter beside a note. He read to late, "I needed you when you still needed me." Jonathan swallowed hard and opened his eyes. The street was back. The cracked pavement. The distant sound of traffic. The food in his hands. He took a bite. It wasn't the taste that broke him. It was the realization that Emily's kindness came with no conditions. She didn't know his name. She didn't know his past. She didn't know what he had lost or what he still had buried beneath layers of ruin and regret. She fed him anyway. Jonathan had once donated millions to charities, but no gesture had ever felt as heavy or as honest as the single meal. Across the street, people passed without looking. Jonathan noticed everything. He noticed how Emily's shoes were worn thin at the heels, how she carried herself like someone constantly bracing for impact, how she never lingered, as if staying too long might cost her something she couldn't afford to lose. He noticed because he had once been the one people noticed. Now, invisibility was his armor. What Emily didn't know was that Jonathan had chosen this life deliberately. After the scandal, the board betrayal, the public collapse, he had walked away from what remained. He wanted to see what the world looked like without power, without influence, without his name opening doors. What he hadn't expected was how quickly dignity eroded, or how one woman, with almost nothing, could rebuild it piece by piece. Jonathan finished the meal and folded the container carefully, setting it beside him. For the first time in years, he wondered something dangerous. What if this wasn't punishment? What if it was preparation? By noon, Emily's stomach had learned not to complain. Hunger wasn't a feeling anymore, it was background noise, like traffic or ticking clocks. She moved through her shift at Riverside Diner with mechanical precision, refilling coffee cups, smiling when required, apologizing for things that weren't her fault. Emily, table 6, her manager called, and tried upsell dessert this time. She nodded, even though she already knew table 6 wouldn't order dessert. People who came in during lunch rush didn't want sweetness, they wanted speed. As she wiped down the counter, her thoughts drifted back to the bus stop. They always did. She wondered if the man had eaten, if he'd stayed warm, if anyone else noticed him the way she did. Years ago, she might have asked his name. Now, she knew better. Names led to attachment, and attachment made loss sharper. Flashback. The day everything fell apart. Emily remembered the rain. It had been coming down hard the night Mark died, blurring the road, smearing headlights into white streaks. She was folding laundry when the knock came. 2 officers stood in the doorway, hats in their hands. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just sat down because her legs stopped working. At the funeral, people told her she was strong. They didn't see the nights she pressed her face into Mark's pillow so Noah wouldn't hear her sob. They didn't see the eviction notice 3 months later, or the way employers looked at her or some and paused when they saw the gaps. Single mother, part-time hours, no flexibility. They didn't say no outright. They said, "We'll call you." Back in the diner, Emily counted her tips. It wasn't enough. It was never enough. After her shift, she stopped by Noah's school. He ran into her arms, backpack bouncing. "Mom, guess what? I got a B on my math test." "That's amazing," she said, forcing brightness into her voice. "Are we having spaghetti tonight?" he asked. Emily hesitated for half a second. "Too long. We'll see," she said, kissing his forehead. On the walk home, they passed a closed storefront with the For Lee sign peeling at the edges. Emily slowed without realizing it. She used to dream of opening a small bakery. Nothing fancy, just warm bread, honest food, something that felt safe. She shook the thought away. Dreams were expensive. That night, after Noah fell asleep, Emily sat at the small kitchen table, staring at overdue bills. Her hands trembled as she circled amounts she couldn't pay. Her phone buzzed with the reminder, rent due in 5 days. She thought of the homeless man at the bus stop. She wondered how close he lived to this same kind of edge. What Emily didn't know was that her quiet kindness had already begun to ripple outward, moving through a man who had once controlled boardrooms, markets, and millions, and soon, those ripples would come back to her in ways she couldn't imagine. The bench at the Jefferson Avenue bus stop was empty. Jonathan noticed immediately. At first, he told himself, she was running late. Buses were unreliable. Mornings were chaotic. Life happened. But the minutes passed. 6:10, 6:15, 6:25. The street filled with strangers, but none of them carried a familiar tote bag. None of them slowed their steps. None of them looked at him the way Emily did, not with pity, but with recognition. Jonathan's chest tightened. He had learned not to depend on routines, yet somehow, without realizing it, he had built his mornings around hers. She didn't come the next day either, or the day after that. By the third morning, Jonathan stood for the first time in weeks. His legs protested, stiff and unsteady, but worry pushed him forward. He paced the length of the street, scanning faces, watching buses pull up and leave. Nothing. A thought settled in his mind, quiet and dangerous. What if something happened to her? Flashback the cost of looking away years earlier. Jonathan had ignored warning signs the same way. A missed call from Claire. A delayed response from his assistant. A board meeting moved without explanation. He had believed problems resolved themselves if left alone. They didn't. They compounded. Standing on Jefferson Avenue, Jonathan felt the weight of that lesson again, this time. Without money or power to shield him, that afternoon rain began to fall, cold and relentless. Jonathan pulled his coat tighter and sat beneath the overhang of a closed pharmacy. His hunger returned, sharper now, not just for food, but for certainty. By evening, a young boy appeared near the bus stop, sitting on the curb with his backpack clutched to his chest. His shoes were too small. His eyes scanned the street with anxious hope. Jonathan recognized him instantly. "Excuse me," Jonathan said gently. "Are you Emily's son?" The boy looked up, startled. "You know my mom?" Jonathan nodded. "She usually comes here in the mornings." The boy's lip trembled. "She fainted at work," he said. "They took her to the clinic, but they won't help unless we pay first." The words hit Jonathan harder than any headline ever had. "How much?" he asked. The boy shook his head. "I don't know. She told me to wait here." Jonathan looked at the child alone, scared, carrying responsibility no 7-year-old should bear. In that moment, the choice became clear. For years, Jonathan had hidden from the world to understand it. Now, the world was asking him to step back in. He reached into his pocket and felt the worn business card he'd carried without purpose, a remnant of the man he used to be. Tonight, he would use it, not as a billionaire, but as a man repaying a debt that could never be measured in money. Emily woke to silence, not the hum of her apartment, not the distant traffic outside her window. This silence was padded, controlled, expensive. She opened her eyes slowly. White walls, soft lighting, machines blinking quietly at her side. This wasn't the community clinic. Panic surged through her chest as she tried to sit up. "Easy," a calm voice said. She turned her head. The man sat in a chair beside her bed, clean-shaven, hair neatly combed, wearing a charcoal gray suit that fit him like it had always belonged there. Her heart skipped. It was him, the homeless man from the bus stop. "I'm sorry," Emily whispered automatically. "I don't know how I got here." "I can't afford." "You're not being charged," he interrupted gently. She stared at him, confused. "How?" He exhaled slowly, as if weighing every word. "Because I paid." The room felt suddenly too small. Emily looked him over again, noticing things she hadn't before, or maybe things that hadn't been there before. The way he carried himself, the quiet authority in his voice, the watch on his wrist, simple, but unmistakably expensive. "Who are you?" she asked. He hesitated. "My name is Jonathan Hale," he said, "and I owe you more than I can explain." Flashback the call that changed everything. Hours earlier, Jonathan had stood in a private hospital corridor, phone pressed to his ear. "Yes," he said calmly. "This is Jonathan Hale." There was a pause, then a sharp intake of breath on the other end. Within minutes, doors opened, policies bent, questions disappeared. Money moved faster than it ever had when it mattered least. Back in the hospital room, Emily's thoughts raced. Jonathan Hale. The name echoed somewhere in her memory. News articles glimpsed on diner televisions. Headlines about a fallen CEO who had vanished years ago. Her voice shook. "You're that Jonathan Hale?" He nodded once. "I didn't tell you because I didn't want your kindness to change," he said quietly. "You never looked at me like I was broken, or useful, or important." Tears filled Emily's eyes, but not from shock, from understanding. "I fed you because you were hungry," she said. That's all. Jonathan smiled. Something soft and almost fragile. That's why it mattered. He stood, smoothing his jacket. Your son is safe. He's eating. He hasn't left the building. Emily covered her mouth, sobbing. I spent years thinking money defined my worth, Jonathan continued. You showed me what dignity looks like without it. She shook her head. I didn't save you. Yes, he said gently. You did. Outside the room, footsteps approached administrators, doctors, people waiting for instructions. Jonathan turned back to her. This isn't charity, he said. This is gratitude. Emily didn't know what that meant yet, but she was about to. The press called it a comeback. They said Jonathan Hale had returned to reclaim his legacy, to rewrite his story, to prove something to the world. They were wrong. Jonathan stood at the podium of the Hale Foundation launch. Cameras flashing, reporters murmuring, but his eyes searched the crowd for only one person. Emily sat in the third row, hands folded tightly in her lap. Noah beside her in a borrowed blazer that made him sit up straighter than usual. He swung his feet nervously, whispering questions. She couldn't quite hear. Jonathan found them, and for the first time since losing everything, his voice didn't shake. This foundation exists, he said, because one woman chose kindness when she had every reason to choose herself. The room fell silent. She fed a stranger every morning, not knowing who he was, not knowing what he had been, but knowing he was human. Cameras turned toward Emily, her face flushed. She wanted to disappear. Jonathan continued, I lived on the streets to understand loss. What I didn't expect was to be taught dignity by someone who had almost nothing. He paused, emotion threading his voice. This foundation will fund medical care, housing support, and education grants for single parents because no one should have to choose between compassion and survival. Applause erupted. Emily didn't clap. She cried. Months later, life looked different. Not perfect, not easy, but stable. Emily worked part-time while completing a certification. Jonathan's foundation quietly covered. Noah attended school without fear of eviction notices taped to their door. One morning, Emily packed oatmeal again. 2 containers. Habit was hard to break. At the bus stop, Jonathan waited not in a suit this time, but in a simple coat, standing beside her instead of sitting apart. You don't have to bring food anymore, he said gently. I know, she smiled, but I want to. They sat together as the sun rose, the city waking around them. You know, Emily said softly, I never asked why you stayed silent. Jonathan looked out at the street. Because when people knew who I was, they wanted something. With you, I could just exist. She nodded. That's all I ever wanted too. The bus pulled up. Life moved on, but the story didn't end there. Across the city, shelters expanded. Clinics stopped turning people away. Single parents slept easier knowing help existed not from pity, but from understanding. And in the quiet spaces between headlines, one truth remained. It wasn't money that changed everything. It was a single mother who fed a homeless man every day, unaware he was a billionaire CEO, and in doing so, reminded him what it meant to be human. Millie woke to silence, not the hum of her apartment, not the distant traffic outside her window. This silence was padded, controlled, expensive. She opened her eyes slowly. White walls, soft lighting, machines blinking quietly at her side. This wasn't the community clinic. Panic surged through her chest as she tried to sit up. Easy, a calm voice said. She turned her head. The man sat in a chair beside her bed, clean-shaven, hair neatly combed, wearing a charcoal gray suit that fit him like it had always belonged there. Her heart skipped. It was him, the homeless man from the bus stop. I'm sorry, Emily whispered automatically. I don't know how I got here. I can't afford. You're not being charged, he interrupted gently. She stared at him, confused. How? He exhaled slowly, as if weighing every word. Because I paid. The room felt suddenly too small. Emily looked him over again, noticing things she hadn't before, or maybe things that hadn't been there before. The way he carried himself, the quiet authority in his voice, the watch on his wrist, simple, but unmistakably expensive. Who are you? She asked. He hesitated. My name is Jonathan Hale, he said, and I owe you more than I can explain. Flashback the call that changed everything hours earlier. Jonathan had stood in a private hospital corridor, phone pressed to his ear. Yes, he said calmly. This is Jonathan Hale. There was a pause. Then a sharp intake of breath on the other end. Within minutes, doors opened, policies bent, questions disappeared. Money moved faster than it ever had when it mattered least. Back in the hospital room, Emily's thoughts raced. Jonathan Hale. The name echoed somewhere in her memory. News articles glimpsed on diner televisions. Headlines about a fallen CEO who had vanished years ago. Her voice shook. You're that Jonathan Hale? He nodded once. I didn't tell you because I didn't want your kindness to change, he said quietly. You never looked at me like I was broken, or useful, or important. Tears filled Emily's eyes, but not from shock, from understanding. I fed you because you were hungry, she said. That's all. Jonathan smiled. Something soft and almost fragile. That's why it mattered. He stood, smoothing his jacket. Your son is safe. He's eating. He hasn't left the building. Emily covered her mouth, sobbing. I spent years thinking money defined my worth, Jonathan continued. You showed me what dignity looks like without it. She shook her head. I didn't save you. Yes, he said gently. You did. Outside the room, footsteps approached. Administrators, doctors, people waiting for instructions. Jonathan turned back to her. This isn't charity, he said. This is gratitude. Emily didn't know what that meant yet, but she was about to.